The 18th century in England is called the Classical Age or the Augustan Age in literature. It is also called the Age of Good Sense or the Age of Reason. Though Dryden belonged to the 17th century, he is also included in the Classical or Augustan Age, as during his time the characteristics of his age had manifested themselves and he himself represented them to a great extent. Other great literary figures who dominated this age successively were Pope and Dr. Johnson, and so the classical age is divided into three distinct periods: the ages of Dryden, Pope, and Dr. Johnson. The most important feature of this age was the origin and development of novel. This new literary form, which gained great popularity in the succeeding ages and which at present holds the prominent place, was fed and nourished by great masters like Defoe, Richardson, Fielding, Smollett, and others who laid its secure foundation. The 18th century is called the Classical Age in English literature on the account of three reasons. In the first place, the term classic refers in general applies to writers of the highest rank in any nation. This term was first applied to the works of the great Greek and Roman writers like Homer and Virgil. As the writers of the 18th century in England tried to follow the simple and noble methods of the great ancient writers, they began to be called classical writers. In the second place, in every national literature, there is a period when a large number of writers produce works of great merit. Such a period is often called the classical period or the classical age. For example, the reign of Augustus is called the classical age of Rome, and the age of Dante is called the classical age of Italian literature. As during the 18th century in England there was an abundance of literary production, the critics named it the classical age in English literature. In the third place, during this period, the English writers rebelled against the exaggerated and fantastic style of writing prevalent during the Elizabethan and Puritan ages, and they demanded that poetry, drama, and prose should follow the exact rules. They were influenced by the French writers, especially by Boileau and Rapin, who insisted on precise methods of writing poetry and who professed to have discovered their rules in the classics of Horace and Aristotle. The 18th century is called the Classical Age because the writers followed the classicism of the ancient writers, which was taken in a narrow sense to imply fine polish and external elegance. But as the 18th century writers in England followed the ancient classical writers only in their external performance and lacked their sublimity and grandeur, their classicism is called pseudo-classicism, that is to say, a false or sham classicism. As the term classical age is therefore too dignified for writers of the 18th century in England, who imitated only the outward trapping of the ancient classical writers and couldn't get at their inner spirit, this age is preferably called the Augustan Age. This term was chosen by the writers of the 18th century themselves, who saw in Pope, Addison, Swift, Johnson, and Burke the modern parallels to Horace, Virgil, Cicero, and other brilliant writers who made Roman literature famous during the reign of Emperor Augustus. Of course, to term this as the Augustan age is also not justified because the writers of this period couldn't compare favorable with those of the Augustan age in Latin literature. But these terms, the classical age and the Augustan age, have become current, and so this age is generally called by these terms. The 18th century is also called the Age of Reason or the Age of Good Sense because the people thought that they could stand on their own legs and be guided in the conduct of their affairs by the light of their own reason, unclouded by respect for ancient precedent. They began to think that undue respect for authority of the ancients was a great source of error, and therefore in every matter man should apply his own reason and common sense. It was widely assumed during the 18th century that since every man is competent to decide by reference to his own reason on any point of natural or moral philosophy, every man becomes his own philosopher. It was in the 18th century that, for the first time in the history of English literature, prose occupies the front position. As it was the age of social, political, religious, and literary controversies in which the prominent writers took an active part, and a large number of pamphlets, journals, and magazines were brought out in order to cater to the growing need of the masses who had begun to read and take interest in these controversial matters. Poetry was considered inadequate for such a task, and hence there was a rapid development of prose. In fact, the prose writers of this age excel the poets in every respect. The graceful and elegant prose of Addison's essays, the terse style of Swift's stars, the artistic perfection of Fielding's novels, the sonorous eloquence of Gibbon's history, and the oratorical style of Burke have no equal in the poetical works of the age. In fact, poetry also had become prosaic because it was no longer used for lofty and sublime purposes, but, like prose, its subject matter had become criticism, satire, controversy, and it was also written in the form of the essay, which was the common literary form. Poetry became polished, witty, and artificial, but it lacked fire, fine feelings, enthusiasm, the poetic glow of Elizabethan age, and the moral earnestness of Puritanism. The 18th century was deficient in drama because the old Puritanic prejudice against the theatre continued and the court also withdrew its patronage. Dear viewers, the 18th century is a long period. That's why it will be dealt with in different videos entitled The Age of Pop, The Age of Johnson, and 18th century novel and 18th century drama. We will be right back.